everyone's a significant person. And because of that, we, you know, we want them to be able to develop the skills to achieve their potential, to find their talents and interests, to find out where they fit and to make a contribution, and to be able to feel like they are able to be a contributing member of society.
Welcome to the Empower Podcast, the show where we discuss big ideas with leaders and change makers as we work to create a Mississippi where everyone can rise. This is Grant Callen. Thank you for joining us. You know, at Empower, we spend a lot of time talking about work, educational attainment, economic mobility, and income growth because opportunity matters. We believe work is foundational to building a good life. But here's a deeper question. Is economic success enough? In Mississippi, household incomes have climbed in recent years, and that's good news. Those gains represent real progress. But think tanks and policymakers can sometimes confuse the measurement tool with the mission. Household income, GDP, labor force participation, these are all measurable indicators, and they matter, but they're tools, not the ultimate goal. The main objective should always be about more human flourishing, in whatever form that takes. So the real question is this: even with rising incomes, does more money necessarily translate into more meaning, more purpose, and more flourishing? Or is economic growth only one piece of a much bigger human story? Today's guest has spent his entire career wrestling with exactly these type of questions. Dr. Clay Routledge is Executive Vice President and COO at the Archbridge Institute, where he leads the Human Flourishing Lab. Before joining Archbridge, he spent nearly 2 decades in academia as a professor of psychology, management, and business. His work explores meaning, purpose, nostalgia, faith, ambition, hope, and the psychological foundations of human progress. I ran across Clay's work about a year ago, and I have found it deeply relevant to what we're trying to accomplish at Empower. So I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since. Clay, welcome to the Empower Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Grant. It's great to join you, and it's great to meet you.
Well, I thought I could just have you on and we could talk about our beards, because you got a great beard. But then it would be a waste, and we might lose my audience. So let's don't start with beards. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Where are you from, and how did you get interested in existential psychology?
So I started out interested in existential psychology when I was starting my graduate training. I have a PhD in psychology, and originally I was looking at other topics that are relevant to human flourishing, like risky behavior, addiction, things that we see as personal barriers, like to living well. But then I got introduced to this idea of existential psychology. And at the time, I really thought of existentialism as most people probably do, if they think about it at all, which is as a philosophical endeavor. And then what I was surprised and really pumped up to learn was there are actual empirical scientists, behavioral scientists that were using the tools of modern social and behavioral science to try to study these big questions. Now, that doesn't mean science can tell you what the meaning of life is, but what science can do is help us understand the extent to which certain aspects of our lives are predictors of meaning. So, just as one quick example, and one most people will easily understand, it turns out that social relationships are really important to personal perceptions of meaning. People who say they have a good family life, close friends, that they feel like they have a socially fulfilling existence, also report that they have a strong sense of meaning in life. And so you can look at things like that and see like, well, what are the contributors to meaning? Just like economists can look at various indicators as proxies or, predictors of certain economic outcomes. Psychologists can do this with our attitudes and perceptions, our goals and behaviors and so forth. So I got really excited because I was like, oh, I'm interested in those big ideas, but I'm a very science-oriented, empirical-oriented person. And, so I thought, well, I'm not going to be a philosopher. And I didn't think I was smart enough to be a philosopher, to be honest. But then I was like, oh, like I'm a science-minded person. If you can study these things doing experimental behavioral science type of work, I'm in. And that's how I got introduced to the idea in graduate school. And then I became really fascinated with specifically the uniquely human cognitive capacities that allow us to ask big questions. So as far as we know, no other organism out there, at least on this planet, is grappling with the type of existential questions that we do. Like we ask, what is our purpose? Will our lives have meaning that transcends our brief time on this planet? Why do bad things happen sometimes? Why do good things happen? Why does the world sometimes seem unfair? These are these kinds of questions that animate us, but we don't think animate other organisms. And so I was really interested in that, but not just our capacity to ask these questions, but critically how the way we answered them, it has implications for our overall well-being and flourishing. And so I became really interested in, what we in psychology call human motivation. Like, what are the psychological needs or motives that energize us, that drive us to do things, good and bad, with the goal, of course, of wanting good things, of wanting people to live healthy, happy lives in which they're productive members of society, productive members of their family, and that they have high levels of mental, psychological well-being. So that's how I got it, originally interested in it. I had no idea there was such a thing as existential psychology when I was in high school or even an undergraduate. Once I got into grad school, I saw there was this whole field, and then, I kind of went all in on it.
Hmm. And was there a moment where you kind of thought, like, the way that we culturally seem to measure success so much around economics really leaves something out of what it means to be human and how we ought to measure success?
Yeah, and to be honest, that didn't really come to me until much later in my career, because early on I was just really focused on what we call basic science. I was really trying to understand the fact that humans are uniquely able to ask these types of questions about the purpose of our existence. What does that do to us? Like, how does that influence us both positively and negatively? So we know, for instance, that if people feel like their lives lack meaning, if they have no purpose, it's really bad for their mental health. It's one of the strongest, if not the strongest, predictors of suicide. Right. So just from a mental health and psychological well-being perspective, these deep questions matter. And so I was very interested and narrowly kind of focused on psychological well-being. But then as I advanced in my career, I started to see as you're pointing out, I started to see that there are these connections and started to think more holistically, because like you said, on the one hand, we have people focusing on like economic well-being and prosperity. And then we have people focusing on social health or community health, right? We have these different areas of life that matter towards living the good life. And, I started to notice that not that there wasn't anyone doing this, but there wasn't a whole lot of cross-pollination between these ideas. Like people tend to stay in their own lanes, especially in academia. And then to your point, what I started to realize is obviously it's important for people to meet their economic needs, to have some financial security, to have those types of goals, to have basic security. But humans are concerned with much more than that, right? I like to say, like, unlike other organisms, we're not just focused on our survival, we're also focused on our significance. We want to have lives that deeply matter. And sometimes that even means we do things that we purposefully trade, economic prosperity for meaning. People pick professions all the time where they say, I could make more money doing X, but I would rather do this other thing because that's my calling, Right. And so people do make these holistic judgments. In fact, I've done a lot of consulting work I used to be a business professor in addition to a psychology professor. And I've also done a lot of consulting work with organizations, including companies. And one of the things that people often find is people will be dissatisfied or burned out at work. And it's not because they're not getting paid enough. Of course, some people complain about that, but a lot of times it's because they don't feel meaningful. They don't feel they don't see the significance or the value of their work. And so even when you just look at professional outcomes about whether it's climbing, professional growth, or whether it's like even like climbing the income ladder, it's not always as simple as a calculation of, well, just pay people more money, for instance, and they'll be happy, well-adjusted employees who don't want to quit. A lot of times there's these other factors that involve these more existential motives about people wanting to feel like their work matters and that they matter there, that they're actually making a contribution.
Hmm. So people find meaning in a lot of different things. I'm curious how much of your work has looked at the connection between people's profession, their work, the thing they end up spending most of their waking hours doing, and how much of that is connected to people's sense of meaning.
Yeah. So work is connected to meaning in two ways, or two general ways, and then there's a bunch of ways within that. And the two general ways you'd say are directly and indirectly. And so directly is what most people think about when they think about the meaningfulness of work. And that is, I go to work, and when I'm at work, I feel like the job I'm doing is meaningful. It gives me meaning directly. And this can be for a lot of reasons, but the biggest predictor of meaning is what we call mattering, is feeling like you matter. So if you're in an organization, regardless of your specific role, your specific duties, the thing that seems to matter most for whether or not you see that job as meaningful is the extent to which you feel like you play a significant role in that organization. So, you could make a lot of money and feel like, what, this is a scam. Like like I'm not doing anything that important, and you're not going to see your job as directly providing meaning. But if you see that you have some kind of important role to play in the success of your organization, or in the clients and customers you serve, or in the community that you live in, your work's going to feel meaningful. And there's a ton of data on this, including studies looking at having experimental studies where they randomly assign some workers to really focus on their personal career growth goals, and other workers to focus on how their job is making a difference in the world. And what they find is the workers who were encouraged to focus on how the job makes a difference find their work to be more meaningful than the workers who were encouraged to focus on how their job serves their own personal career goals. So that sense of you are actually making a difference is really big. So that's the direct link to meaning. But there's also an indirect link that I don't think we talk about as much, which is even if you find your work not fulfilling in some ways, it's not your dream job, it's not the thing you want to do forever, if that work is providing you with an income and a way to help contribute to your family, then it's indirectly helping provide meaning, because because a big part of meaning is feeling like you matter, right? And feeling like you matter to your family, that you're providing for your family, would make you feel meaningful, even if you feel like, well, this isn't my dream job and there's lots of things I don't like about it. It still can provide meaning because it is the source of income that's helping you. Or, there's other things. It's helping you be a role model to your kids and say, it's important, it's important to work. So you'll see this a lot with people climbing the income ladder, or even immigrants moving to the United States, and they're doing a job that they don't necessarily want to do, but they'll say things like, well, I'm trying to provide a better life for my kids so they can pursue their dream jobs. And so they see it as very meaningful, but in a more indirect way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think just sort of experientially, I know people in my own life who are in very missional type jobs that are pretty unhappy. And I
Hmm.
also know people that are in very menial jobs or maybe repetitive jobs that don't have a lot of inspiration. And yet, because of the rest of their life and their values, it like they're happy in that job. That
Right.
job is not where they get their meaning; they get it other places. I guess one of the things that I think is that's so important about this conception of work, as you're talking about, is the application to public policy.
Hmm.
And a lot of public policy conversations invariably come back to how do we help those in poverty climb?
Hmm.
And one way of thinking is that we need to give them more things. And
Hmm.
if we give them more things, that will help them meet the needs of their families, whether that's food stamps or housing vouchers or various other public assistance programs. And that will somehow help people climb the ladder and build a great life. And then there's another way of thinking, which candidly is the one we emphasize,
Hmm.
that really, Arthur Brooks' conception of earned success that he
Hmm.
talks about is really critical to this conception of building a great life, because without earning your own success, you really lose that sense of meaning and purpose and connectedness to the work you're doing. Um, how do you see this? I mean, how do you see this playing out in our policy conversations?
Yeah. Well, I genuinely agree with it, with that perspective and the Arthur Brooks example. So, if I can take a step back and talk about the subcomponents of meaning a little bit, which I think is very useful here, is there's different models of meaning, but the most prominent model in psychological science is kind of this three-factor model, which says meaning consists of three things. It consists of coherence, which is, you're having you can think of it more as like a structure, right? Your life has a structure. There's a coherent story of where you come from, where you're going, and what your day-to-day sort of structures life. The opposite would be like chaos, right? Like having a very like disruptive, chaotic life. There's purpose, which is the second factor, which is you have clear goals and direction in your life. And then the third factor is called mattering. Sometimes people say significance, but it's basically like I have an important role to play, right, in this cultural drama. Like I'm an important character in this cultural drama. Those three things combined, kind of drive meaning. I think the last one, mattering, more recent empirical evidence has suggested that it's the strongest predictor of overall perceptions of meaning. But if you think about that three-factor model and you think about what we're talking about with work, it makes so much sense that work plays such an important role in people's lives because, one, if you have a job to go to, it does provide coherence and structure. You have a reason to get up every day, you have responsibilities, you have duties, and that helps structure your life. It's not the only way you can structure your life. You can be a stay-at-home mom who has a very structured life, right? Because you have responsibilities. But the key there is you have some kind of role or some kind of job that provides that kind of coherence, I think, and that's part of your story. And then the goals part, right? The purpose, which is like you have things that you're striving towards. If the government provides everything, whether it's through generous welfare programs or we're hearing these discussions more and more about a future without work because of AI and robotics. We're going to have UBI and all of that. That kind of utopian fantasy. So however, whatever example you want to use in these cases, the idea is that, well, you won't have any earned success, right? You'll just be given some kind of stipend or support. Um, that seems to be in conflict with this idea of a purpose, because you want to have goals or things to work towards not just in terms of your personal life and your hobbies, but in terms of like feeling like you are actually contributing to society in some way. And then and that leads to the final factor of mattering. And One of I used to actually work long ago, decades ago, before I was in academia. I worked a little bit in outpatient mental health. And one of the things that we tried to do, and we were working with patients that had severe psychiatric conditions that made it very difficult for them to go to work. Many of them were on Social Security disability because they had schizophrenia, and so they really struggled. But we really tried, when possible, to help them get jobs, right? Even though they wanted to, most of them actually wanted to work. They wanted to, they didn't, obviously they didn't like having auditory and visual hallucinations, but they wanted to be contributing members to society. It structured their life. It gave them goals, and it allowed them to feel like they're in the game, right? They matter. And so even in situations in which we had very good reasons to say people need support systems because of brain disease, people really want to contribute in some way. And we would work hard on job placement to help these people fit in some way. So I just think that I agree with you is a long way of saying that. And I just think it's just really important that we not lose track of the fact of, like, individuals need a role to play in their families and their communities, and work is one of the big ways to do that.
Hmm. Well, so you brought up AI, which
Mm-hmm.
I really wanted to get into. Let's dig a little deeper there. Like, do you think AI threatens what for a lot of people will be their sense of meaning?
No, I don't think so. And the reason, and I mean, I definitely can see all of the arguments about the existential threat of AI, existential both in the personal sense, as we're talking about, and in the civilizational sense of the worst case scenarios of AI destroying us, right? Um, but I'm an AI optimist. And the reason I'm an AI optimist is because I think that even if AI is capable, as it seems to be doing, of doing complex cognitive work that we once saw as the domain, our domain, um, it doesn't, it can't, like, replace the holistic experience of being a human being, of being a parent, of being a family member, of being someone who's deeply interested in experiences of awe and wonder, of love. And so I think, even like every other technological disruption, I'm sure there'll be difficulty, economic difficulty and transition, but I'm pretty bullish on humans being unique and being able to steer this in a way that allows it to help us, reach our full potential even more. And again, I'm not trying to pretend that there's not going to be any challenges, but what makes life meaningful can't be replaced by
Mm.
AI, because, as we've been talking about, what makes life meaningful is really the sense of mattering. And where do you get that? You get it from other people, right? You get it from mattering in the lives of other people. So we're very human. Another way of saying this simply is, like, meaning is very human centric, right? And AI is not going to take that from us. Imagine if an alien species landed tomorrow on the planet and they were considerably more intellectually sophisticated than we are. So they could just show us, here's all the technological advances that we're willing to share with you. Would people all of a sudden feel meaningless? Like, I don't think so. We'd still have families. We'd still have interests and curiosities and goals we want to pursue, and aspirations and ambitions. So I just don't see AI as I think it could be, obviously it can be weaponized by adversaries in ways to try to divide and demoralize us. I think we see that with some of the deep fake and misinformation types of campaigns. I think obviously it's going to create a lot of disruption, as it potentially can replace certain jobs. But we're creative. Like, we'll create new jobs. We'll find new ways of doing things. And then if you want to get into the most science, like science fiction sort of scenario, well, what if AI and robotics completely displaces the need for human labor at all? Well, I don't think we're just going to we're going to throw in the towel, right? In this science fiction scenario, I think we're going to find new ways to to be builders, to be creators, to be entrepreneurial. And if that involves some kind of different economic system, and first of all, that seems so far off and so remote. I don't think, I'm not losing a lot of sleep over that. But even if that was the case, I'd be like, well, we've gone through major changes before as a species, and we're still here, and we're still pursuing existential ambitions. And I just think that'll continue to be the case.
What about the connection between meaning and the broader digital world, not just AI?
Mhm.
20 years ago, we all sort of thought with the expansion of social networking and social media that this would make us more connected,
Mhm.
stronger relationship bonds. And by almost any measurable way, it's made us less connected, less, our communities are not as strong. There is a loneliness epidemic. At the same time, more of my friends are a push button away.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
how how do we recover this sense of meaning? And what would you say to young people that are sort of faced with this digital onslaught that's zapping some of our meaning and connectedness?
yeah. Well, I'm actually pretty bullish on young people might be the ones that figured this out and teach the rest of us. In the sense that we are seeing some trends with young adults of them being the ones that are saying, "Hey, we love technological innovation." They're early adopters. They like this stuff. When you're young, you like new gadgets, and you like technology, and you're curious, and you're open minded about these things. So they're not rejecting that. They're not old fashioned, but they're doing something kind of old fashioned, which is they're saying we're missing something from our lives. So we did this survey at the Archbridge Institute on what we call historical nostalgia, which is feeling nostalgic for a time before you were alive. And what we found is young people are very high in this type of nostalgia. They're very interested in the analog, tactile, in-person world that they feel like they didn't necessarily grow up in, because they grew up in the age of the internet and the always online digital world where they felt like they were being surveilled and monitored and everything. You get canceled for doing that, and you couldn't make any mistakes or say the wrong thing, and things felt less authentic. And so what we're seeing is a lot of young people are actually rediscovering old ideas. If you go to any major city, and I'm sure it's, is this way in smaller cities as well, you can go to bookstores. There's more independent bookstores now than, they're growing. The number of independent bookstores is growing. And
Mhm.
remember, Amazon was going to kill the independent bookstore. So once you get to my age and you're using progressive glasses like I am, you start using the Kindle digital reader, and you think of it as an amazing innovation because it allows you to read in low light. Um, and that's great. But young people are saying, you know what's cool? Going to a bookstore and talking to other people and going to book clubs and going and having game nights at breweries and playing in person tabletop games. And you're just seeing these trends of young people being excited about and curious about doing things the analog in-person way. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have these other challenges of digital tech, but monitoring some of these trends has made me more optimistic, I guess, than I used to be. That human, the human ingenuity and people kind of figure this out. So we go through these periods where something's new and exciting, and we check it out. And this has been kind of the case with social media. And there are positives because there's many things about, for instance, this conversation you and I are able to have thanks to digital technology. Um, there are many positives, and people are recognizing that. But people are also, to your point, saying, you know what, that we feel like there's something missing in our community life and our social life. And I think we've reached a tipping point on that. And this isn't just my intuition. There's data suggesting that a greater number of people are putting up sort of self-imposed restrictions on their social media use. People are closing their social media accounts in greater numbers. people are looking for more in-person, offline opportunities. So that's not to dismiss concerns that people have, but I think that people will figure this out. And my preference is for people to figure this out without government, with a lot of government meddling, because, the government doesn't have a great track record of doing top-down changes. I see this as more of a bottom-up cultural and individual movement in which people are saying, we want all the benefits of technological innovation. We like remote work. We like being able to talk to grandma on FaceTime who lives far. We like all these things. They're awesome. We like just look at how media has been able, we've had new media that's come out, and it's democratized access to information in a lot of ways, but we feel like something's missing, and so I think there's a retro revival happening. And, surprisingly, young people seem to be major drivers of this. More so, Gen Z and millennials are more interested in this form of retro revival than boomers are, it seems. And so there's something going on there.
Well, so if that there's a lot of indications that things are moving in the right direction on that front. One statistic that seems to be moving in the wrong direction, it is something y'all have looked at Archbridge, and that is whether people think the American dream is still in reach for them. And I've heard you talk about that number, the number of people who think it's out of reach is climbing.
Yeah.
So what is the American dream? How do people think of it? And why do people think it is more out of reach today than it was a few years ago?
Yeah. So the good news is, to start with the good news, the majority of most Americans still believe that they've either achieved the dream or are on their way to achieving it. But to your point, there's growing skepticism about the American dream. There's a number of different ways to talk about it, or, points to make on this that I think are worth people knowing. One is to your question about how do people define the dream. If you read a lot of media commentary on the American dream, it's almost always framed in terms of economics. And so people will say, look, it's getting harder. Housing's getting more expensive. It's harder to buy a home. Home ownership is a big indicator of the American dream. Again, not to dismiss that is important. We do think, we do want people to have more opportunities, economic opportunities, and more ability to pursue home ownership. But what we find in our work is that's not actually how most Americans define the American dream. So there seems to be a disconnect between the kind of media commentary on what the American dream is and how actual everyday Americans define it. And what we find in our national surveys, and when we ask Americans, we give them a list of things and we say, to what extent is this essential or not to living the American dream? What we find is freedom and how to live your life and a good family life top the list. And there's strong consensus. Over 90% of Americans agree that those things are essential, right? And things like, like financial wealth is much lower, like a much smaller percentage of people say that. So I think there's something that in the conversations we have, I think that's something that's missing, is oftentimes you see commentary that's talking about all these economic challenges. Again, I'm not trying to dismiss those challenges. That's part of our work at Archbridge too. We're very interested in removing barriers to people pursuing, economic success. But that's just to say that when Americans actually think about the American dream, they're thinking about something much more holistic than just money, right? So that's part of it. But to your point, to your point about the trends going in the wrong direction, another interesting finding is, and we don't just find this about the American dream, we actually find this about a lot of different issues, which I find quite fascinating, but also educational, and how our society, like, we're having these cultural problems. And that is when you ask people about their own life, they seem to actually be pretty optimistic in general. And not just in the American dream, we've done studies on surveys on hope. So if you ask people, are you hopeful for your own future? Are you hopeful for the future of your family? Most Americans, the vast majority of Americans say yes. If you say you're hopeful about the future of your community, the number ticks down a little bit, but it's still high. If you say you're hopeful about the future of the country, that's where you see the big drop. If you say, are you hopeful about the future of, of human progress, of human civilization, again, another big drop. If you ask people about the American dream, they're way more confident in their ability to pursue it and to reach it than they are in other Americans' ability to perceive it. So there's this weird disconnect between people's optimism for their own lives and how they see the world outside of, especially outside of the walls of their community. And we don't have causal evidence of what's going on there, but it doesn't seem too surprising to me given the amount of negativity we see in our media discourse and the amount of pessimism we see, where story after story is about how all the ways that America's gone wrong and all the ways that, people on the other side of the aisle are trying to destroy the country, and all the ways about how, we're the bad guys in the world. You just see all this negativity about society and the cultural discourse. And so it seems to me that would be contributing to this idea of like, people know what's going on in their own lives. You can't lie to them about that. People could say, hey, things seem to be going pretty well in my life. But you can more easily manipulate or color how they see the world out, especially outside of the community where they don't have direct access to. And I just think there's so much cultural pessimism around that it's distorting people's views. Does that matter? I think it matters because, one, that eventually does end up kind of contaminating your own perspective. Like, it's demoralizing if you're feeling like, hey, I'm doing well, but most Americans can't. Like, that it's hard to have like a really good spirit about that. Most people want everyone to do well. They want the whole country to do well. And so I think that in itself is kind of depressing a little bit. So I do think it matters. But in addition to that, I think it also contributes to polarization. So for instance, there's been research in which people are asked, what percentage of Americans do you think put toxic content on, behave badly online and are toxic online? And people will say like 40%. It's 3%. Right? The vast majority of toxic content online is produced by a very small percentage of very active users. But what happens is that distorts, and then you have this media commentary about it. It turns us against each other. You get people thinking, oh, look at how horrible Democrats are, and look at how horrible Republicans are. Everyone believes this. They take the worst examples of behavior on any one side of an issue, and then they treat it as if that represents everybody. And so you have this divisive, polarizing content. And I think that matters as well because it's also demoralizing and depressing to feel like, if you honestly believe like half the country is wants to destroy the country or is actively destroying the country, if it makes you more suspicious of your neighbors, and it reduces social trust. It makes it harder to compromise and to come together and to recognize that people have different perspectives, and or to have any sense of humility that you're not right about everything. That's bad for cooperation. It's bad for for compromise, and it's bad for patriotism, which is an important component, I think, of not just the societal esteem, but also individual esteem. Like people, to my point earlier about people want to feel like they matter. People want to situate their own personal meaning in a broader cultural meaning, right? They want to feel like I'm an important contributor to a meaningful cultural project. People don't want to be like, hey, I'm doing well, but my country's horrible. That's not a recipe for good mental health. It's not a recipe for a healthy society. And so, I know you asked me specifically about the American Dream Survey, but just wanted to broaden it out a little bit. We see this across different surveys of people feeling better about their own life and their own ability, which is a good, that's a good story too. People feel agentic. They feel like they do have the capacity to improve their lives. But this like broader pessimism about the world outside of themselves, I think it's not a government barrier, but it's a personal psychological and social barrier. Because just, for instance, like if you're going to be an entrepreneur, right? If you have an idea, maybe, do you want to, are you going to take the kind of risk to do that if you feel like you feel like you can't trust, you can't trust other Americans, it's a kind of it's a defensive anxiety kind of provoking thing that I think that reduces innovation and reduces entrepreneurship. Because people feel like, well, why should I take risks? Why should I try to do something big and impactful if our country's going in the wrong direction anyway? And so I just think it has, even though it seems like it's just a societal level effect, I think it actually has individual level effects that end up ultimately being bad for society, because you have fewer people that want to do big things and take on big projects that and want to solve big problems.
There are real barriers that people face to achieving the American dream, or more broadly, just having human flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
And y'all look at some of those barriers at Archbridge. So what are you finding as the biggest barriers that people face?
So we tend to divide barriers into two general classes. One we call artificial barriers, and these, you can think of as policies, right? Regulations or things that are more top down. Like, so we do a bunch of work on occupational licensing, for instance. And so these are, a person can be as motivated, inspired, entrepreneurial as they want, but if your state says they can't do job X because they don't have the appropriate licensure, they haven't gone through the particular educational or whatever the specific guidelines and requirements are for a certain job, then that's a barrier to them doing it. And it can be, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this stuff, it can be things that most people I think would find absurd and just don't know about. Because they think that, because I think the general view on this is like, oh, licenses are here to protect us, right? They're here to provide some kind of customer or quality control or protection, safety, and sometimes that can be true. Of course, I want the person flying my plane to have some kind of qualifications,
Sure.
right? I'm a psychologist. Even in my area, for example. There's evidence that, people that have psychology, but not psychiatry, not medical degrees, can be just as effective at, with the right training at prescribing medications. But they're not allowed to do so. So there's just things like that you can actually do empirical work to see, like, is there a legitimate concern here? You can compare yourselves to other states or other countries and say, does this really matter? And then you could say, well, there's not really a good reason for this restriction. So those are things that we call artificial barriers. Sometimes they're well-intentioned. People think that, they make sense, but they don't. And so we do a lot of work trying to bring attention to those and, offering, promoting solutions that, that states can work on to remove these types of barriers.
And before you move off that one, I'll say the last interview we had on the podcast was a constitutional lawyer in Mississippi who has fought for some improvements in that occupational licensing landscape. And one of the earliest cases he had a few years ago when he started his practice, incidentally called American Dream Legal, is to fight for someone who was doing eyebrow threading. And, the state said you've got to have a cosmetology license to do eyebrow threading. Never mind that all of the hours of schooling that she would have to go through to get a cosmetology license taught nothing about eyebrow threading or anything that would help her become a better eyebrow threader. And it wasn't a public safety issue. This is a very safe practice. And ultimately, he filed a suit against the government. And in order to settle the case, the cosmetology board went to the legislature and said, would you just take this out so that eyebrow threaders aren't subject to the same cosmetology license? And he won the case. Now she's doing eyebrow threading all over the state, has built this company, and she's doing it all without having to have a cosmetology license.
That's great. Perfect. That's a perfect example. And you can see how that's a barrier to flourishing that, when removed, and to the specific testimony is an example of someone saying, get out of my way and let me go for it. And so, there are things like that. But then, I'm a psychologist, and, one of the things we're also interested in is Archbridge is what we call more natural barriers. And so to use the same example from before, you could imagine a perfect regulatory situation where we've successfully removed all the barriers that exist to somebody pursuing a particular field or entrepreneurial endeavor, but then they just, they don't have the skills to do it. They're not motivated to do it. They have, disruptive family life. They have all the, addiction, mental health problems. And so these other barriers that exist as well, that matter because, you can, like I said, you can remove the regulatory, hurdles, but that doesn't guarantee you that you'll have a thriving, economic ecosystem. And so both matter, and we're very much focused on both. And, I think they're connected as well, which, people don't think about that much, because sometimes you can have these big regulatory barriers that can can be demoralizing. It can make people feel like, well, it doesn't, nothing I do matters. I can't get a break. Right. So you can see there's this connection between, the kind of framework that governments can set up, and also the sort of individual psychology of how you build a meaningful life. And so I think they work in tandem. Is you want to have both. You want to have an environment, a regulatory environment that encourages and allows people to pursue their aspirations and to build meaningful lives. But you also need those cultural, social, and individual psychological components. This is why family structure matters a lot. This is why living in a healthy community matters a lot. And this is why teaching young people to be agentic, to be aspirational, to take personal responsibility. These old ideas that we that we hold on to, they matter, because at the end of the day, those things that you have in your control are going to play a significant guiding role in building a meaningful life. And in addition to that, they're connected because it's that individual agency that we want to encourage that often is the pathway to removing those external barriers. And your example is a perfect example of that, of somebody taking it on themselves to say, you know what, this is a ridiculous rule. We should fight to get rid of it. And that's going to take work, and that's going to take resilience. It's going to take persistence. It's going to take some creativity. It's going to take cooperation. It's going to take, it's going to take going and talking to people and persuading people. So all of that is stuff that happens at the individual, community, and kind of societal level. But that's important to changing policy as well.
And a lot of that, while well-meaning, is protectionist in nature. You often see sort of the status quo, institutional forces trying to keep things the way they are. We're about out of time, but let me close with this question. You mentioned agency, and agency is, to me, so critical to this. It's this idea that people actually can control their own destiny. They have tools to better themselves and their families and their community. We have a lot of lawmakers that listen. And so as I guess my last question would just be, apply this whole conversation we've had, and maybe specifically about agency, to lawmakers as they're thinking about crafting policies. How can lawmakers craft policies that respect the agency of humans, that recognize meaning and purpose are so important to what it means to be human, and we don't want to take that away?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the things that is a challenge for lawmakers, and also people in the think tank world, and people in the, I'd say the kind of classical liberal world, who are very much focused on this issue of individual agency, is that the messaging gets distorted and you see a lot of pushback, and it kind of comes in the, the well-intentioned concern of, you don't care about people, and people are suffering, and you just want to leave people on their own, and the government has these responsibilities. You see this kind of framing that is that treats, I don't think intentionally, but that treats humans as the passive recipients of the good life, right? As that. So here's an example you hear a lot. People will say, America's the richest country in the world. It can do X. and if you scale that down to to an intimate family level that everyone can understand, I think it makes sense why that's a problem. So you could be a rich family, right? And you could say, well, I could just give my kids everything. Why teach them anything? Like,
Sure.
just make their life comfortable and easy. And guess what? Most parents know that that's not the path to your children being fulfilled and feeling meaningful and being meaningful contributors. And, parents want their kids to learn skills. They want them to be able to take responsibility for themselves. They want them to be able to build meaningful lives and feel like they're in the driver's seat at some point. And so I think that scales out, actually. and well-intentioned efforts to treat people as if they're just passive recipients and that the government can solve all their problems. And then framing that as, if you don't think that, like, you don't care about people, it is a challenge that, to the lawmakers, is a messaging and a communication challenge that can be overcome, but takes effort, I think, because you have to do like what we're doing here. You have to talk to people about, actually, we want people to live meaningful lives. We think every individual has a role to play in society. Everybody matters, right? Everyone's a significant person. And because of that, we want them to be able to develop the skills to achieve their potential, to find their talents and interests, to find out where they fit and to make a contribution, and to be able to feel like they are able to be a contributing member of society. Earlier, I was making the point about suicide. There's a model of suicide that's a very powerful, empirically validated model that says one of the two strongest predictors of the desire to die by suicide is feeling like you don't matter, and feeling like a burden on society or on your family. And oftentimes, from a psychologist point of view, we think of these things as distorted cognitions, because it's really sad. Because a lot of times people will be like, no, that this family member really does matter. They mean a lot, but they've got distorted thinking on this. But I bring up that because suicide is like the low point of meaning, right? It's saying, like, my life is so meaningless that the best thing I can do for my family is to not be here anymore. And so I think that's just a good illustration of how powerful that need is to not be a burden, but to be a contributor. And I think every individual should be treated, as if they have that potential to be a contributor. And talking to people about that and focusing on that and not just the economic side of things, which of course matters, but talking about that human side of things and what humans want and what humans need, their social, their psychological needs, is an important way for policymakers to have better conversations with the community and think about framing the topics and the issues that they're interested in those terms of what really matters to everyday people. Sometimes in the think tank world, we get lost in, sort of in the weeds of the economic and regulatory variables. But it's important to remember at the end of the day that behind these variables are people, human beings with humans' aspirations and hopes and fears and challenges and stressors and all the things that, that make life tough and amazing. And focusing on that more, focusing on that human side of things more. And it's a lot easier to connect with people and explain to them why you're advancing the policies that you're advancing.
Well, that's well said. Folks can read more of your work at the Archbridge Institute. Clay, thank you so much for your time and for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Grant, for having me. It was great to chat with you.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode of the Empower Podcast. To learn more about how you can get involved and we can work together to make Mississippi a place where everyone can rise, go to our website at empowerms.org. Please like or subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you'll be notified of future episodes.